Hello, BookTube. Well, as you can see, I have a guest with me, and unlike my last guest, I managed to fix the view on Zoom so that it's not me and then them, me and then them. Instead, it's both of us side by side. This is my friend Zach from the Brattle Bookshop in Boston.
Hi, everybody.
And because we're side by side, every time he says something dumb, you'll be able to see my priceless facial reactions, which were lost. In that previous discussion with Matthew Capucci, they were lost.
Well,
There's no internet
I'll
record.
be able to see that. Oh, well, that's too bad because that's the worst part, or the best part for some people. I want to be able to gauge your reactions too.
And for those of you who are joining me new, there are a couple of hundred of you who are here, who are new from the last time when Zach was here. Zach works at the Brattle Bookshop. Would you care to give us a thumbnail description of what the Brattle is? Sure.
It's probably the oldest continuously running antiquarian bookshop in the country. It started in 1825. There's always been a Brattle Bookshop in Boston since then. Gone through a lot of different ownerships. The current owners, Ken Gloss and Joyce Kosofsky, Ken's father and mother bought the store in 1949, and it's been in the Gloss family since then. And we have, we're one of the few shops in the country that sells a large stock of general used books on all subjects, but also a large stock of antiquarian and collectible books on all subjects. So not many places left are doing both.
And eventually they hired you.
Eventually they did. That's how we're calculating years now, before and after. So we're in year 17 AZ.
And you, to preface our conversation today, you've also done, you're not just showing up and working the register, not that there's anything wrong with that. I did that myself for a long time. You've also done all sorts of independent training.
Yes.
Books and whatnot.
Yes, bibliography, book history, at the Rare Book School, which is located at UVA in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is a wonderful organization. They have summer week-long courses there, and also at satellite locations around the Northeast, basically wherever the best collections they can find for whatever they're teaching. So it's a wonderful organization, but there, and picked up a couple languages along the way. So that's helpful too. And I think I
remember some of those summers that you went away for your seminars. I remember some of those where you were gone. You'd be telling me for weeks, I'm leaving, I'll be gone all summer. And then I wasn't listening because I was too busy complaining about the weather, as old people do. And especially then you were gone, and I would go up to some new hire and say, you know, I was telling Zach about this thing that bothered me in 1971. Let me tell you. I swear the Brattle must have gone through a dozen employees who just fled because they had to take on a burden that you had been genetically engineered to endure. So they were just like, oh no, what's this?
Well, we actually have a couple new part-time hires starting this week, and we gotta, as your viewers I'm sure will understand, we want to give them a couple weeks under their belt before they meet Steve.
One of them didn't though. One of them showed up to talk. He showed up for, I think, just an orientation thing on one of his first days, and I just happened to be there at the buying table. Nicole had to say, here's coworker A, here's coworker B, and that's Steve.
Yeah, Steve's here.
The kid was like, I don't know who this is. Should I be taking notes?
He's going to be the one doing the talking, but it's of no consequence.
But so you say that you picked up languages along the way and that you've studied books and book history and book grading and book collecting. And that brings us to our subject today.
One of my favorites.
Because it's not just, I mean, you viewers have told me that you love listening to Zach talk about the antiquarian book trade, just in general, but that there's a sweet spot, and it's Russian lit. And so we're dealing with Russian lit today. We're dealing with Dr. Zhivago.
There's your copy.
This is my old paperback here.
Let me ask you, who published? Is that like a Bantam paperback?
This is Signet.
Signet paperback.
Yeah, okay. On my channel I mentioned that for some weird reason, I don't know why, I really like this paperback, and somebody out there sent it to me.
Uh,
Very nice of them to do. I'm not sure if this is going to tell me who translated it, right? These earlier books usually don't.
I think it should be somewhere in there, right? Or maybe
Max
it's
Hayward and
Max Hayward,
Anya
okay.
Harari.
There you go.
This
So
is
I
the
think
translation by them.
I'm pretty sure that was the translation for the first English edition.
Or no, Max Hayward. No, that's right. They translated the book, and then the poems of Yuri Zhivago were translated by Bernard Gilbert Gurney.
Yeah, and those I think were, so the first English edition of Zhivago came out in 58, both in the US and England. And the sort of the order of publication is a little bit of what we're going to talk about today, or what I'd like to talk about.
Who saw it first? If it came out in 58 in the UK and America,
yep.
How long had Russians been reading it before then?
They had not read it.
They had not read it.
And that's one of the very interesting things about, well, they hadn't read a published version. A few people, if you had read it, you had read a typescript at that point in Russian, because it did not exist in any published form. Authorized.
So it's yet another great Russian book that saw light first in translation.
That's right. So the first edition of Zhivago in print was in Italian, and it was published in 1959 by Feltrinelli in Milan. So that is the first edition of Zhivago, 1957, and it's in Italian. And that's consequential because, well, for one thing, we know that Feltrinelli had a contract with Pasternak, which he kept secret for many years to protect Pasternak, because one of the big problems Pasternak had was the Soviet authorities did not want him publishing abroad. They did not want that book published abroad.
Why was that? Do you know?
They didn't want the book published at all. It was.
But do you know? I mean, do you know what their objections were, other than them just being general poopy heads?
Well, you can imagine that the content is not, it's not socialist realism. It's certainly not, and I think you can see very easily if you read the book. Now, you like the book, right?
I love the book, yeah. And it is. I am asking mainly for the viewers. I think it's easy to see implied criticism of the Soviet state all through the book.
All through the book. So it was an unpublishable novel in the Soviet Union.
Okay, but the Milan version was not pirated. Pasternak knew about it.
Pasternak not only knew about it, he authorized it. He signed a contract with Feltrinelli, and because Feltrinelli got the first book out, or the first published edition, which again was in Italian, he held the international copyright, which is an important element to the story of how subsequent editions of Zhivago came out across the world and in different languages, and ultimately in Russian, which is what I want to talk about today, because I have in my hand a couple early editions of Zhivago in Russian.
Zach always brings props in case any of you are wondering. He not only brings props, but he's surrounded every day by props at the store.
But I'm a prop comic. I'm not writing new material for you. This is all I got. So this is one of my favorite books of all time. And when I talk about books, I'm not talking about a text. Steve is the text guy. When I talk about a book, I need something I can hold, and that is this beautiful version of Dr. Zhivago in Russian with a nice dust jacket. I'm going to show you this. I don't know, Steve, if you recognize this academic publisher's imprint. It's changed a little over the years.
That's Russian, you say?
No, this is Russian.
Okay,
but,
so
it has a little English right there.
So have we jumped a chapter? You said we started with there not being a Russian edition.
Well, we're going to get there, but we're going to sort of fill in the gaps between 1957 and when these came about. So I have this. This is a hardcover edition of Dr. Zhivago in Russian, and I'll tell you right now that this was published in 1959. So 2 years after the Italian edition came out. And I will also tell you, before I tell you more, that this was published, this symbol right there, if the reflection isn't coming in too badly, is the University of Michigan Press.
You're right. Their color font hasn't changed much at all.
Hasn't changed much at all. I also have.
I wouldn't recognize it on that book because it's the last place I'd expect to see it.
Well, and that's the last place a lot of people expected to see it, including Mr. Feltrinelli, who will remember held the international copyright to the book, to the work, I should say, Dr. Zhivago.
Yes, that was the brief exchange that Zach and I had at the shop when he brought up Dr. Zhivago. I was immediately wanting to say, "Oh my God, we could talk for 40 minutes about the doomed love affair." And he was like, "Slightly foxed, dusted, very rare, very fine." He didn't care about the contents of the book.
I love literature. I love the texts, but I don't enjoy talking about them so much because you're allowed to like what you like. I'm allowed to like what I like. I still think you're not allowed to not like a few things that I really like in particular, but that's for another day.
Now you've got everybody on tenterhooks because you've got somebody breaking copyright. This is as good as a Russian thriller.
Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. But before I do, I want to show you this other version of Zhivago. Also, Dr. Zhivago in Russian, in two little pocket paperback books, so broken up into two books. And I'll show you the title page of the first volume. It says, Dr. Zhivago. This one, I don't know if it's coming through at all, but it claims to be published in Paris by a publisher, the Société d'Édition and Impression Mondiale.
Which I'll tell you. The camera.
What's that?
Shove the lower part right up to the camera. So it'll focus, right? Yeah, there we go. Look at that.
There you go.
Oh, it's worse and worse for that original Italian publisher.
Well, I'll tell you right now that publisher, the one in Paris that has its imprint on this book, totally made up. Doesn't exist. Never existed. So.
Who published it? Was it you?
Yeah, it was not. It was not me. It was not me. Okay, so backtrack. So I'll say, and this came out, so the Zhivago Michigan edition came out in January 1959. And these little paperbacks started showing up in the fall of 1959.
So Feltrinelli lost control of this thing.
Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. He sort of lost control. So as soon as the Italian edition came out, both, not so much Pasternak, but Feltrinelli and a number of other people wanted to get a Russian language edition out for a lot of reasons, but mostly political reasons. It was something that the Soviet Union didn't want published, didn't want available to the Soviet Russian language reader. So of course, this being the Cold War, a lot of Westerners and including Western governments wanted the Russian people to be able to read this novel.
Okay.
Steve, this book came out a few years ago. I don't know if you read it when it did.
I did.
And it's talking all about how the CIA helped get Zhivago in print in Russian.
Right, but you know the story, and I've read the book, but there are lots of people watching who don't know either.
Who don't.
I thought we would just dramatize this. I'm practically putting in RCA sound effects.
That's right. Well, so there have been multiple books written about this, and I liked the book that I just showed. It focuses much more on the CIA activities than the actual published editions of books. But the short version is Feltrinelli wanted to put out his own Russian language version.
Okay.
And he had the typescript. He had Pasternak's, typescript from which he got the Italian translation.
And he didn't need Pasternak's permission, right?
Nobody had it. Well,
he had Pasternak's permission to make a Russian edition that would certainly have made trouble for Pasternak.
Well, it's a little murky because their contract that they had specified every language except Russian.
I would assume.
Even though Feltrinelli didn't have explicit permission from Pasternak, he was still planning a Russian edition once it became clear that a Soviet edition was not going to come out in Russian, that there was no chance of that. So Feltrinelli got in touch with a publisher in the Netherlands, Mouton, Mouton. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it.
Always the Netherlands making trouble.
But a big publisher, and they had experience with printing Russian, and he was going to produce the Russian edition through them. So that was all in the works, mostly in 1958. Unbeknownst to Feltrinelli, while this is all happening, somehow the CIA got a different typescript of Dr. Zhivago, and they decided, wouldn't it be fun if we could covertly and through intermediaries get a Russian language edition out? Probably, we could prepare the proofs here. They had found a publisher in New York who specialized in expatriate Russian printing. You may have seen some, if people are like me, like Tommy's Dot Russian language books that were published outside of Russia. You might be familiar.
Yeah, the CIA had a whole squad of people that looked for.
Well, they did, and the Chekhov publishing house out of New York published a lot of prohibited Soviet or Russian literature prohibited by the Soviets. And the CIA got in touch with them to produce to set in type Zhivago in a Cyrillic typeface that would be untraceable to the US. Because remember, the CIA, even though, of course, the Soviets would suspect that they had a hand in this, didn't want it to be provable. So the CIA plan was to have those proofs prepared in New York and then sent somewhere in Europe to have the books actually printed. And then their plan was to distribute copies of this Dr. Zhivago edition at the book fair in Brussels in the fall of 1958.
Now, was this typescript edition that they got the same one that Feltrinelli got?
It's unclear. No one that I've read has been able to identify exactly which version of the text or which typescript the CIA got and how they got it. That is sort of a mystery.
I wonder if anybody at the CIA, in addition to thinking about winning a skirmish in the Cold War, thought, this is wonderful. This is a modern classic.
Yeah.
I wonder if anybody thought that. If anybody thought, that's the reason I want to do this, is because it's a classic that people should read.
Yes. I don't think that had anything to do with it. I don't know if any of them ever read the book. They outsourced most of that. But the guy they outsourced it to, their agent who was to find the US-based printer to set the type for the book, was a guy named Felix Morrow of the Morrow Publishing Company. And so they gave him their typescript, and he found the group in New York, the Rawson brothers is who actually did the original typesetting for what we'll call the CIA edition. But then through 1958, the CIA kind of dragged their feet. They were able to find a publisher in Europe who would potentially print the book. Turns out it was that same company in Amsterdam, or in the Netherlands, Mouton, who Feltrinelli had been independently working with to put out his Russian edition. But Morrow kind of got impatient with the CIA and all those machinations, and he decided to give the Russian typescript to his friend, who was the head of the University of Michigan Press. And they got it in their idea to put out a Russian, or they got the idea to put out their own Russian edition of Zhivago. And so completely independent of the CIA, completely independent of Feltrinelli, who, remember, held the authorized rights to actually publish Zhivago, but maybe not in Russian.
So what does that nightmare that you just described do to the collectability of this book? Where does that put you?
Well, thanks to a scholar out at Stanford named Paolo Mancuso, it actually puts me in pretty good position to know exactly which version of the Russian text came out and in what order. So what happened was the CIA finally got their act together and were able to print 1,000 copies of their edition of Dr. Zhivago in time for the Brussels Book Fair in 1958. It looked actually I'm taking the dust jacket off of my Michigan edition. It looked very much like this, except it was in blue cloth. And they distributed it at the Brussels Book Fair. Interestingly, Mouton, because they knew that they were also dealing independently with Feltrinelli to get out his edition, as sort of a half-assed way to maybe keep his copyright intact, they put his imprint in Russian at the bottom of their CIA edition. So the CIA edition of Pasternak in Russian actually says Feltrinelli, Milan, and then 1950.
Even though he had nothing to do with it?
He had nothing to do with that edition. That's right. But they put his name on it anyway to hopefully keep him happy, to keep his copyright intact, because they still wanted the business to publish his edition in Russian that was an authorized edition, rather than the surreptitious one that the CIA did first. But being good booksellers and publishers, they wanted to get paid by both. So they didn't want to turn down the CIA's 1,000 copies, but they also didn't want to ruin their deal with Feltrinelli. Now, you can imagine Feltrinelli, when he got wind that there was an edition bearing his name that he had nothing to do with, which he did pretty quickly after the copies started showing up, he was pissed. He's going to be pissed later on in the story too. He was pissed a lot because he was the only person who had a contract with Pasternak, but a contract that he would never make public because it would endanger Pasternak. So when we're talking about priority, which is what book collectors and book dealers fetishistically seek.
Is there one of the versions that you're talking about that's noticeably more collectible than the others?
Yes. If you have, the CIA through Mouton put out 1,000 copies of what is the first Dr. Zhivago in Russian. And it is that hardcover in blue cloth. And it is fantastically valuable. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars if you can find one. You can't find a lot of them for many reasons. A lot of them were destroyed if the Soviet authorities found them. A lot of people, in order to aid smuggling, ripped the cloth covers off so that they could more easily conceal them because it was a hefty book.
Has a copy with that dust jacket ever walked into the shop?
Well, so that copy didn't have a dust jacket. It just had the cloth.
Okay.
The first
intact,
Russian
intact with its boards and all. Has that ever walked into the shop? What would you do if it did?
I would. I don't know. I don't expect. I expect everything pretty much to come into the shop. I don't expect to.
I expect the Yiddish word for what you would do would be plots. You would plot.
Yeah, I would.
Which has the virtue of so many Yiddish words of not needing a translation.
That's right. That's right. It's very onomatopoeic. But
Hey, before we get back to the story, though, I'm curious
Yeah.
about the Brattle itself. If a version of that CIA in perfect condition, let's say it was
Yeah.
in some suitcase for all this time, walked into the shop, what would the shop do? You'd
well,
have to
if
have
I
it.
wasn't there to see it, hopefully they'd get me. But I would, it's the kind of book that if I saw it, I would recognize it. I would know it.
Right.
There's only, you can't,
Do you
there
think
are
the
other
chances, if let's say somebody's granddaughter
yeah,
had no idea that
had
grandmother
no
was
idea.
a spook
It's
and walked that into the shop and
possible.
wanted $20 for it, what would you do?
I
Knowing
would
that
tell-
she has a gigantically collectible thing.
Yeah. Oh, I'd tell them, no, that's, I'd tell them what it is, first of all. And come up with a fair price, which would be more than $20.
But would that be a case on previous videos we've discussed items that sort of warrant maybe floating the possibility to the owner that they have it auctioned?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
That'd be a case where it might be better in their better interest to have a bidding war on the thing than for the Brattle to make an offer.
Right. And what I do in that case is I'd sort of lay it out for them, tell them what, if they went to auction, what percentage of a auction price they would actually get.
Right.
As opposed to what we could offer.
Oh, right. Because those percentages can be hefty, right?
They are very hefty.
Oh.
Usually the consigner, who's the person who gives the book to the auction, it comes away with about 60%.
Oh my. Oh my, I had no idea it was that high.
Yeah. Of what the buyer from the auction.
If that ever happens with the Brattle, I think the better, simpler solution would just be for you to take out your wallet and plunk down $50,000 there and then for your own sake. Just put it in your own collection.
That's right. Yeah, well, yes.
I should point out, any of you who are suddenly wide-eyed, Ken is a generous employer, but he's not that generous.
That's not. And it's, well, at any rate. So yes, that is, to say the least, that is a very collectible version. For many years, it was assumed that the second version of Zhivago in Russian, so the second in priority after that virtually unobtainable edition, was Feltrinelli's own Russian language edition, which was published in the spring of 1959. He finally did get it out. He made peace with the Dutch publishers and put out his own edition.
And the university edition?
We're going to get to that. But interestingly, on that, it still said copyright 1957. Because Feltrinelli's, remember, his first copyright was for the Italian edition, which was published in 1957. So for many years, lazy booksellers, and even some librarians who just didn't have the correct information, cataloged that book as being published in 1958, but say if they published as, copyright 1957, but published in 1958. Mm-hmm. We know now, thanks to that fantastic researcher at Stanford and his number of books, which are wonderful, and have the best information you can get on the publication history. We know that the Feltrinelli book was not the second version available in Russian, and it was actually not published until May 1959. The second edition to appear in the Russian language, and the first authorized edition to appear in the Russian language, was the University of Michigan edition. And it was published looking very much like this. It didn't have a dust jacket. The first 500 copies that Michigan published in January of 1958, January of 1959, so before Feltrinelli's own edition, which came out that spring, the first 500 copies that Michigan printed didn't have a dust jacket. It was just the orange cover with some titles on the spine. Those 500 copies were sold and ordered so quickly that they came out with a second printing a month later, in February of 1959, and they put a dust jacket on it. And that's what this is.
Okay.
So how did Michigan get theirs published?
Well, yeah.
We talked about Felix Morrow. He got them the manuscript when he thought that the CIA was taking too long getting theirs out. And Michigan started to produce their own version. Now they had some scholars from the university go over the typescript, realized there were a lot of errors in it, just misspellings, various things that they needed to clean up. And in fact, if you look at the edition that was published by the CIA, that one is, riddled with errors. It's not a great version of the text. No,
so
we
the
can't,
Russian
because
versions are not identical.
absolutely,
It's easy to, even if you had no outside indicia, you can still easily tell which is which if you know what you're talking about.
That's right. You absolutely can. But basically, Feltrinelli found out at some point in 1958 that Michigan was putting together their own Russian version. He started sort of litigation. He sent letters. There are a lot of great letters, which again, in Paulo Mencoso's books, he reprints a lot of the correspondence between Michigan and Feltrinelli, which began very antagonistically, but eventually they came up with a deal that Michigan would publish their version in the US and Canada only, or basically almost like a Monroe Doctrine. They had the Western Hemisphere, and Feltrinelli would have the authorized Russian version for Europe and elsewhere.
Now, with all of these people squabbling over all of these editions, what did this mean financially for Pasternak himself, if anything?
We do know that Michigan held what would have been the author's royalties in a trust, as did Feltrinelli. I don't know if they were ever dispersed because Pasternak passed away pretty soon after that. I don't know if he ever got the money. He certainly didn't get the money from his Nobel Prize, which came in that time as well.
It's a weird thing to think. If it had been published, if he had written this thing in English, working at the University of Chicago and published it, he'd have been a multimillionaire.
Yeah, that's right. But he didn't get it. So anyway, going back to priority, which is what booksellers really want to know and collectors really want to know.
Right. So we've established that priority here first is that first run of the CIA edition,
which you can't get. The second one is the first printing of the University of Michigan.
The one without a dust jacket.
Which is the first authorized, and again, authorized because Michigan and Feltrinelli eventually cut a deal.
Okay. So how findable is that one?
It's hard to find. I've never seen one, but there have been a few up at auction. And it's usually in the, $1,000, $1,500 range. They're very hard to find, though. There are only 500 of them.
Then after that would be the first edition of theirs with a dust jacket?
With the dust jacket, which came out in February. And so this is the next one. Again, the first one to appear in a dust jacket, which I like the artwork a lot for this.
You might not know this, but I off the top of my head don't know. Did Pasternak ever see a bound copy of his own book?
In fact, in Paulo Mencoso's book, and I'm going to get the title here, Inside the Zhivago Storm, which was published in 2013 or 14, there is a photograph of Pasternak somewhere in the Soviet Union holding a copy of the Michigan edition.
Oh my.
Which is I don't know how they smuggled it to him, but yes, he did actually see it in print. So that next comes that edition with the dust jacket. Then a couple months later comes Feltrinelli's
own edition,
his own Russian edition, published in Italy. And then comes these little paperbacks that I showed you at the beginning.
Are those things?
Remember how I mentioned that the CIA edition, a lot of people were sort of tearing the covers off to make them more smuggleable. Well, the CIA got the idea, well, let's just make the books smaller so that they can smuggle them back in. And
that's your tax dollars at work.
lo and behold, this edition in 2 little paperback copies. There are also different variants of this same publication that's in 1 volume, but it's all came from the same CIA funded edition in the fall of 1959, and these were printed again with the express goal of getting them smuggled back into the Soviet Union. So that's what this is.
What if, so you've got Signet, if they want to do a paperback of Dr. Zhivago, this thing sold 1 million copies for them.
1 million copies.
What on earth would they do? Where would they go for what the translator is translating?
In other words, where would they get their where did they get their text?
There are authoritative texts for other Russian, right? If you want to do a new if Peviar and Volkonsky want to do a new translation of War and Peace, they know where to go.
Yes. Well, so the short answer I can tell you with the Russian text, when the best edition of the text came out in, I think, well, I know Michigan's edition of it came out in 1967. So basically, at some point, Pasternak saw all of these versions and noticed immediately the CIA version, which, by the way, this is the same text that as the first edition. He noticed that was riddled with errors. He sort of famously said, it's barely the same, it's barely the same book. A couple French, one woman who was a French scholar, put together a fantastic revised version in the early 60s. Feltrinelli, I think, reprinted it in 63, a revised version of the text, much basically the definitive version of the text. And Michigan, I think, reprinted it in 67.
Do you know whether or not Russian literary circles have now embraced this book?
I know if
that happened with Glasnost and Perestroika.
I really don't know what the reception was like in the Soviet Union, other than hunger to get a copy initially. I don't know how it's held up in.
I visited the Soviet Union, and I never met anyone who didn't love the book. But I never asked, where did you get a copy?
Where did you get it?
It is. I never even thought.
Well, that was probably wise.
Well, I didn't know that the provenance was so tangled at the time. I just it was everybody's favorite book.
Right. Interesting.
Anna Akhmatova was their favorite poet, and they knew pages and pages of her by heart. And Pasternak, Zhivago was their favorite novel, definitely, far more than the more canonical Russian stuff.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's still true.
I'd be interested to know too. If any of your listeners have a handle on that, I'd love to hear about it.
So we're almost out of time here for our Zoom overlords here, but so the thumbnail version is, as a used book dealer, what's the one you're most likely to get walking through the door? It won't be those little editions, right?
The one
definitely won't be the CIA edition.
No, the Russian language we're most likely to get are one from the 60s, either the revised Feltrinelli one or the Michigan one from 67. Those I've seen. I've seen.
So not probably something from the 50s.
No, this is the earliest one I've ever seen from the 50s. Which, by the way, will be for sale at the shop once I finish cataloging it.
And the collectability goes down the further in time you go?
That's right. That's right.